Okay.
And tell me your name again.
My name's Connor.
It usually has a little name thing on there. That usually helps me. But I can remember that.
Okay, I'm just connecting us to the Facebook.
Okay, great.
I think we might be live now. Okay. I'm going to set the Facebook up after because it might take me a minute. If you're watching this, we are going to start in a couple of minutes. I am just waiting for people to trickle in, and then we will begin. Okay, I'm just connecting to the Facebook right now. And then once I do that, we can start. Okay, I'm just connecting to the Facebook right now. And then once I do that, we can start. Okay, we're connected. All right, thank you for joining us. This is the Pequot Libraries Meet the Author. We are happy to have returning speaker, Martha Hall Kelly. She is a novelist hailing from Massachusetts. Her debut novel came out in 2016. It's called Lilac Girls. We've had her come and speak about that novel here at the library before. She followed that up in 2019 with Lost Roses. And today she will be speaking to us about her newest novel, Sunflower Sisters, which takes place during the Civil War. And I think we'll be spanning all those books as well during this conversation. And we're really excited to have Martha here. And so I'm just going to hand it over to her. Thank you for joining us. And
Thanks for having me, Connor.
we're going to host a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat and we will get to those at the end. And thank you, Martha.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. It's so nice to be back at Pequot Library, even virtually. Hopefully someday back live again. Seems like things are opening up, so that's exciting. So I don't know how many people have read Lilac Girls and Lost Roses, or Sunflower Sisters for that matter. So I thought I'd go back in time just a little bit to give you a small background on how I came to write the books. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to do about 15 minutes of Q&A if you have any questions, which I hope you do. That's always my favorite part. But so I wanted to take you back in time to the year 2000 when I lived in Fairfield, Connecticut. Now I live in Litchfield. I'm actually in New York City today at our little pied-à-terre, but I live in Litchfield. But back in 2000, I lived in Fairfield and had 3 little kids. And my mom had just passed away. It was Mother's Day. And I was unbelievably sad about having Mother's Day without my mother. And my husband said to me, why don't you go up and see that house you've always wanted to go see? And he was talking about the Caroline Ferriday House and Gardens, which I bet a lot of the people that are watching today, since this is in Connecticut, have already been up to Bethlehem, Connecticut to see the Caroline Ferriday House and Gardens, which is such a beautiful museum. And it is the former home of Caroline Ferriday. And she was a socialite in New York City, former Broadway actress, and a huge philanthropist. So when he said, I will take care of the kids, I said, I'm going to get in that car and go see the house, because he knew I wanted to go see it. I had carried in my wallet a spread from Victoria Magazine, and the headline on it was Caroline's Incredible Lilacs. And it had a little picture of Caroline as an actress. She was so beautiful. And a little picture of the house. And I love old houses. And also a picture of the lilacs. And my mother and I really liked them. So I thought, well, that would be a really nice way to kind of honor her. And so I went up there, and I was the only person on the tour that day. Now they're averaging about 80 people a day up at the house. So it's changed a lot. But at the time, I was the only person on the tour, and I loved walking around the garden. And, the lilacs were in full bloom. And, we just went through lilac season. So you can imagine the garden was just full of that scent. And afterwards, I thought, well, I paid I don't know what it was then, $3 or something. I'll go in and take the house tour. So I was the only person on the tour that day, which was really, really nice. And I had a great tour, but it was all about the man who built the house, Reverend Bellamy, back in the 1700s. And while it was interesting, I just was kind of minimally engaged, I guess you'd say, until we got to the second floor. And that is where Caroline's bedroom is, and her mother's as well. And her bedroom was so interesting. Right away, it just captivated me. All of her dolls are still there, and there's a kneeler there where she used to kneel to say prayers, and she's got a small desk in her room that had all sorts of Russian artifacts and things on it. So I was really curious about her once I kind of saw her bedroom. And then you go out from her mother's room onto a landing, and her desk is there just as she left it. And they've got her big old Remington typewriter, the manual typewriter that she used to write so many letters on. And she was such a Francophile. She had pictures of Charles de Gaulle and Napoleon. But I was drawn to a small photograph of, say, 50 or so middle-aged ladies lined up in 3 rows. And I asked the docent, who are those women? And she said, oh, those are the rabbits. Those were Polish Catholic women that were arrested by the Nazis when they worked in the underground. They were young women. They were drawn to the underground because it was a social thing. When Hitler invaded in 1939, he eliminated the Girl Scouts, and that they were all what they called girl guides in that country at the time. So they naturally just kind of fell into the underground. The youngest was 14, the oldest was 24, and they were arrested. Hitler he knew when he marched into Poland that he was going to target both Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, because he knew that they were potential leaders, and anyone who was educated he targeted, and the whole intelligentsia he just arrested and murdered on the spot. So these women were arrested for minor crimes, and they were taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp, which is about an hour north of Berlin. And they were taken on the train. And once they were there, Himmler chose them for experiments. And he chose the 74 women and who had the healthiest legs, because their legs are what were experimented on. They were opened up surgically, and all sorts of bacterial cultures were introduced, and they were testing the efficacy of sulfonamides for possible use, another use that Himmler had in mind. So she said that Caroline Ferriday, a friend of Genevieve de Gaulle's, the niece of Charles de Gaulle, when Genevieve, who was imprisoned with these women at one point but was released later, when Genevieve told Caroline that these girls were back in Poland, and they were friends at that point, and they were very sick. I mean, under Stalin, in a way, they had exchanged, one horrible dictator for another, and they had no medical care. And so Caroline went to bat for them, fought through a lot of red tape to get the women who survived. Not all of them survived, you can imagine. And she brought them to the United States for the trip of a lifetime and for treatment. The trip lasted about a year. And once the girls got to the United States, they all spread out and went to all different facilities in the United States, all paid for by whatever that hospital was. And also by money that Caroline raised with the help of Norman Cousins at the Saturday Review. So when she told me about that, and how some of the rabbits actually had come to that house to stay with Caroline, because that's what happened. The women stayed with donors all over the country. I thought, wow, that is so interesting. How did that story just get lost? And so I started researching. Any researcher can go to the Bellamy Faraday house and research down in the archives. They actually bring the archival boxes up now. In the old days, I would go sit in the former root cellar and just kind of go through all Caroline's books and records and things. She was, I don't know if you could call her a pack rat, but she kept everything. So that was super helpful for me. And I had no intention of writing a book at all. But I just was curious about her. And so I did that for a long time, for about 5 years. And then my husband accepted a job in Atlanta at the Weather Channel on the business side. And so I thought, well, okay, there goes my research. I can't do that anymore. And before we left, we had dinner with a couple down in New York. And after we went to dinner, and for some reason, I just started talking about my research that I'd been doing. I don't know why, because I kept it very on the QT, because I thought people would think I was crazy for just kind of being obsessed with this woman that passed away in 1990. But I started talking to this woman. Her name is Betty. Oh God, I always forget her last name. I'll think of it in a second. I started talking to Betty, and she's just lovely. And she said, oh, well, we have a new Polish daughter-in-law, so we're really interested in Poland. And we also, did Mike tell you I'm a book editor? And I said, no, Mike did not tell me that. And she said, all I need is a chapter. You should write this. This would make a great novel. Just send me a chapter. And I said, thank you, Betty, but I have 2 journalism degrees that I never really used. I became an advertising copywriter, but I've never taken a creative writing class or anything, never even thought about that. And she said, just keep it in the back of your mind. So I moved to Atlanta, and I dropped my son off at school one morning, and I didn't know a soul. And I went through the Starbucks drive-through as I was wont to do, and I ordered a decaf cappuccino grande from the barista, who unfortunately, well, actually fortunately, gave me a caffeinated one by mistake. And I went home and the story just started pouring out. It was unbelievable. So thank you, caffeine. Thank you, Starbucks. But I'm not allowed to drink caffeine in my family because I get really crabby. But that day, it worked for me. And so it was wonderful. I had been to Catholic school for high school, and the nuns used to say, they used to talk about when they married Jesus, how they had this ecstasy. And I used to think, oh, that's so cool. I'll never have my ecstasy. And then here it was. I mean, when I started writing that story, it was just crazy. So I sent her my first chapter, and she said, great, keep going, but add dialogue. And I said, well, I don't know how to write dialogue. And she said, just, so I Googled it, and, I just kind of made my way through it. I read a lot of craft books. I love craft books. They're my favorite. And so I just figured out how to do it. And that was an incredible learning, talk about learning curve. And they talk about how you need 10,000 hours to become proficient at something. I think I got that in very quickly because I started working from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and just not letting up. And I never thought, oh, this will get published. Honestly, I just thought, oh, I'll self-publish it. Or I just kind of had, it was like a splinter I had to kind of exercise. And so that was great. I went to Ravensbrück with my son, which was incredible because once I had Caroline's voice down, the two other voices, which one was German. I wanted to write about Hertha Oberhauser, who was the only female doctor. Actually, there were a couple of female doctors, but she was the female doctor on the sulfonamide experiments who operated on these young girls. And I just thought, what is happening there? And then I wanted to include the point of view of one of the rabbits in a kind of a composite character. So I thought in order to do that, I really needed to go to Poland to Germany. So I bribed my son. He was in high school at the time. And I said, you're 17, you're eligible to drink in Germany. So you can have one beer if you come with me. And he suddenly got really enthusiastic about the trip. And I told him that Polish women are beautiful. And he's like very happy, couldn't wait to go. So he was my videographer, and we went to Poland, and that was incredible. Right away in some of the museums, I found one of the letters that the women had written in their own urine in a museum, sitting right there, that the parents had ironed in order for that secret ink to come up. It was just so moving. And then we took the same train route from Warsaw to Berlin, and then from Berlin up to Fürstenberg, that the women had taken. And it was just so, getting off that train platform, the same one that the women had gotten off. Of course, they were met with guards and dogs and machine guns, but it was so, it really brought the whole thing alive for me. And walking around the camp, there was a lot left at the camp, not the blocks anymore, but the punishment bunker, the crematoria, the shooting wall, a lot of it is still there. So it's very, very moving. And I came back after that and really wrote like a crazy person. And I just felt like these were stories that it was a forgotten story that just needed to be told. And it felt like America had promised Poland so much and didn't deliver. And then, I feel like these women got kind of the short end of the stick, because once they got out of Ravensbrück, they were in Soviet territory. And once you're in a Nazi concentration camp, they consider you to be a Nazi, which is so bizarre. Even though, you were there against your own will. So they had to burn, when they lived in Soviet Poland, they had to burn everything that they had from the concentration camps or hide it really well. So I just felt like it just wasn't fair for them that they were put through all that. And I just wanted people to understand that story, that it was, such a wonderful thing that Caroline Ferriday did. And we were such a welcoming country because the girls were worried. They didn't speak English that well. They were Catholic, which at the time was not as kind of accepted as it is today. And we as a country were so welcoming and wonderful. I just wanted everybody to know that story. So once the book came out, it was, I guess you can say, a big hit. We're going on 2 million readers now, which is really exciting. And once that happened, first of all, it was, I'm still kind of pinching myself, but once it happened, my husband said, well, you know, this is your, what did he call it? Like your inflection point or your point of leverage. You need to go back to Random House if you want to write more books. And I certainly did. And so I went back and I said, well, I'd like to write books going back in time, because I had studied Caroline's family so much. I thought, well, I already know all about her mother, and I know a lot about her great grandmother, Jane Eliza Woolsey. So I said, well, why don't I do a World War I book and then a Civil War book and go back in time? And so that's what I did. And the second one was a little scary because the first they had bought a manuscript. The second one was just me saying, I'm going to write this book and it's going to be great. So that was a little scary to sit down and write another book, especially with Lilac Girls being so successful. But that actually became more successful than Lilac Girls. So that was exciting. And for that one, I got to go to Russia with my husband this time. And it was such a dream trip. A lot of vodka and caviar, which was really fun, but also amazing research. And so that is the story of Caroline's mother and how she brought a group of former aristocrats who lost everything in the Bolshevik Revolution. She helped them when they came to the United States with nothing, and also helped a group of them who were in Paris, because a lot of so-called White Russians holed up in Paris. So that is White Russians and White Russians. And that is The Lost Roses. And I got to go back to Paris for that, which was really fun for research, and found this little known part of Paris that is still just it's a very weird place, because all these Russians used to live there and now they just all left, you know, right after World War I. And it's still very like Russian, but there's nobody that lives there. It's very strange. So that was a fun one to write. And then I wrote Sunflower Sisters. And Sunflower Sisters, it was a completely different experience in terms of research, because first of all, I was living down in Atlanta when I started researching it. So it was really fun to go to all the former plantations around Atlanta. And, you know, I had in my head stupidly that, you know, from Gone with the Wind, Tara, I thought I was searching for Tara. Tara, of course, does not exist because it was a film set, but also the plantations, a lot of them are just gone, but also they didn't all look like Tara. There were a few actually that did. They were working farms. And so I went to every one around Atlanta that I could. And that was a really, really good starting point, because it was, there are a lot of them that are still there that are just working farms. And some of them actually had their enslaved cabins, the cabins where the enslaved people lived, intact still. A lot down around Charleston, which is a short drive from Atlanta. And so I did all that I can. Went to Magnolia Plantation, which is a very famous one, a lot of them around Charleston. And so that was super helpful to get to know what an actual working plantation was like, because I wanted to have 3 characters again, which I did in the first 2 books, but this time I wanted to have Caroline's great aunt, one of them, because I knew she had 7 great aunts, and they were all very accomplished and wonderful. And I wanted to feature an enslaved girl named Gemma, and I was hoping I could make her a house slave, which I thought would be kind of interesting. And then the mistress of the plantation. In this case, I named her Anne Mae Wilson Watson. And so I set out to write that. I started with the letters, which are in the Caroline Ferriday House archives. And there's 1,000 letters, and I've read them all. And it was incredible. Just that alone was a real learning experience, because every letter you would hold in your hands had different handwriting, and I came to know which of the 8 children it was. So that was really interesting. And just keeping them all straight was great, because I felt like I was writing like a Little Women type book at one point. Little Women meets 12 Years a Slave, kind of. But in that book, it's 4 sisters, and this, it was 8 children. So it was a little more challenging, but there was almost an embarrassment of riches, because every letter I read almost had some sort of cool scene in it that I wanted to use. So I just made this huge list of scenes that I wanted to use, and then I had to, of course, narrow that down. But the hardest part so it was the Woolseys, if you've read Lilac Girls, like the Caroline chapter, and then in like the Kasha chapter, it was Gemma, the enslaved girl, and then the kind of Herta character was Anne May. So I started with Caroline's family, just because that was my frame of reference. And I started with Jane Eliza Woolsey, who was Caroline's great grandmother. And she was an unbelievable woman. I have loved her since the minute I started reading about her. She was a single mom because they lived in New Bedford. They were a very wealthy family. The father, Mr. Woolsey, Charles, was a sugar merchant, and he would commute from New York City up to New Bedford on a steamship called the Lexington. But one night, the Lexington, whose whole hull was filled with cotton, it caught fire, and only 4 people survived, and he wasn't one of them. There are some reports of him helping people off, but he did not survive. And so Mrs. Ferriday was left with 7 very young daughters, and she was pregnant with an 8th child, who it turned out was a boy that the father never met, and they named him Charles. But it was really, really a hard time for the family, because he was not a Victorian father, a typical Victorian father who, children should be seen and not heard. He was just a really hands-on, lovely father, and it was really hard for them. So the mom, Jane Eliza, moved her family to New York City, and what is now the East Village. The street still exists, which is really amazing. They lived on Brevoort Place. It is no longer called Brevoort Place, but the Brevoort Hotel, the site of that, there's apartments there, and that is where they lived. And so they took up residence in New York City, nearby Mr. Woolsey's brother, Edward, who was very wealthy. He owned most of Astoria, Queens at the time. And when you think about that, the fact that someone could own Queens, it's just amazing. So they were great benefactors, even though Charles had left the family, quite comfortable. It's still really hard when you've got that many children and they needed to be educated. And so it became a family affair. But they were staunch abolitionists. Mrs. Woolsey had grown up in Virginia on a slaveholding plantation and always hated slavery. And she met Mr. Woolsey. I love this story. They were walking in opposite directions on a street in New York City, and they just walked right by each other, and they saw each other, and they both just fell madly in love with each other. And I love that. And she raised her daughters in such a cool way, very similar in a way to like Little Women up in Concord, Massachusetts. They were the girls in the family were educated just as well, if not better, than the son Charles, and they were really, really smart. One of the headmaster, I think, when the last one graduated, said, "Thank goodness she's graduating, because they can't afford to give out any more prizes, because these girls had won all the prizes." And but the hardest choice was which of those women to choose for my focal point character. And it was, I have to say, it was tough. I really loved them all, but I chose the middle daughter, whose name is Georgiana. And Georgie was, I just felt like she had it all. some of the sisters were smart, but they were kind of quiet. She was way out there. And she really, she had a strong want. And in fiction writing, that's one of the big things is your character has to really want something. And she really wanted to be a nurse, and she was not old enough. She didn't meet the requirements really, but, and it's kind of a spoiler, but I guess, you kind of know that she's gonna get at least part of what she wants, but she becomes a nurse. And it's a tough battle for her because back in those days, there were no female nurses. This was the very beginning. The Sanitary Commission was headed up by Frederick Olmsted, who, if you're from Hartford area, you know about Frederick Olmsted and the fact that he designed and built or oversaw the building of Central Park. He was the head of it, appointed by Lincoln himself. And so it was tough because the only nurses there were male nurses. And most of them they had been injured on the battlefield and kind of hung around and became orderlies more. They would move around. If someone died, they would take them off or help to move people around and assist in surgeries. And they did not want to go back to the battlefield. So understandably, but so they fought tooth and nail, these women that were coming in and taking their jobs, because basically the doctors were saying to them, okay, we're good, you can go back to war. And they were like, no. So they did everything they could to kind of sabotage the women, which was tough. And in those days, I didn't realize before I researched for this book, if someone in your family, a male member who was fighting, is wounded, you go down and take care of them. That previously in the United States, that's how it worked. And so the doctors were really prejudiced against women being there in the hospitals because they had dealt with, they were dealing with an amputee, for example, whose mother and sister and aunt arrive, and it's just not a good situation for the hospital. So, but Georgie and the other nurses, there were 100 of them that, fanned out, and they were really, really skilled. They were taught by Elizabeth Blackwell herself, the first woman doctor in the US. And they were super helpful, but not one doctor, as Georgie famously says, invited them in a cordial way. And so it became really tough for them. So I was excited to write about that with Georgie. But also she was married, I don't want to give a spoiler. She had a boyfriend named Frank Bacon. In all of her letters, she talks about Frank. And I thought, well, that will be fun to, show their relationship because it's a real relationship. And also I wanted to show all the other sisters because they all did really cool things, like worked in orphanages in New York City and that kind of a thing. But I also wanted to show, since they were abolitionists, I wanted to show how, from a point of view character, what it was like to be enslaved. So I created Gemma, who was a house slave. And for a while, I kind of hemmed and hawed about where the plantation would be because it needed to be close to New York City because that's where the Woolseys were. And also I knew that they were going to go to Washington and Gettysburg. So I needed something that was close by. So I chose Maryland because it was a border state and they still had slavery up until the very end. And I thought it was interesting to show us a border state because I didn't know that much about it, just, from history in high school. But they were allowed to keep their slaves because if Lincoln was afraid if he took slaves away from the border states, they would become southern states and join the Confederacy. And he couldn't afford that, especially with how close Maryland was to the capital. So I thought Maryland was interesting. And I visited a wonderful plantation there called Sauterley. And if you're ever in Maryland, Sauterley is an amazing place to go visit. And I based the book there, basically. It's on the banks of the Patuxent River, and it's a tobacco plantation. And they still have one of the cabins where the enslaved people lived that is really beautifully renovated. And the main house is also absolutely beautifully preserved. So I really walking around there with my son, he was my videographer. We both just went, this is the place, because it's just so, it was really a lovely, inspiring setting. So that's where I wanted to have my enslaved family living. And then, of course, Anne May, the head of the plantation, mistress of the plantation, I wanted her to be the owner of the slaves, because women could own slaves back then. And I just thought that would be kind of interesting. And I wanted to make her really spoiled and, you know, within reason. And I think I managed to make her very spoiled, because everybody I talked to that's read the book is like, I hate her. She's so awful. And so, but I also wanted to set up a dynamic where Gemma knew how to read and write, because towards the end of the war, especially, more enslaved people did learn how to read and write. And also her previous owner, Aunt Tandy Rose, had taught Gemma to read for her own purposes. She just wanted to have Gemma write her grocery list for her, and also to read her the Bible. So kind of unintentionally, she teaches, you know, she gives Gemma the keys to the castle, kind of, because that was something that they, you know, they did not want enslaved people learning how to read and write, because they knew what that led to. Even Gemma says it in the book. Once you learn how to read, you know, it changes your life. So, so those were my three characters, and I was really excited to get started on them. But I had to do a lot of research first on Gemma and Anne May. Once I had all the letters, I felt like I knew a lot about the Woolseys just from being down in the archives and knowing Caroline and all that. But I really had to do my research on Gemma as well as Anne May. Even though I'd been to all of those plantations for Anne May, I wanted her to be real. So I read in the periodicals and books of the time, which was really kind of challenging, reading things from the 1860s. Read Uncle Tom's Cabin, read a lot of things just written by enslaved people at the time. And that really, really helped. And it made me realize that I wanted to write Gemma's voice, not in that kind of slave cadence, but I wanted to write her in a more realistic way that she would have spoken. And it turns out Anne May was less educated than Gemma. So I like that kind of reversal. And Anne May is originally from Louisiana. So she was from the Deep South and was used to a little different kind of situation with her slaves. And she, of course, treats them horribly. Aunt Tandy Rose had originally wanted to free her slaves at a certain point, which Anne May completely disregards. And this wonderful family that Gemma has, her mom and dad are still intact and together with the family. And she really, really values that and is grateful for that. But sadly, you know, that kind of falls apart at one point. That was unusual for a slave family to be together like that, but without, you know, giving spoilers. But I loved bringing history to life in New York City and Civil War. Things like the New York City draft riots, which I had learned about in school, but not really in depth. And once I found out what really happened in the draft riots, wow! I don't want to say I enjoyed writing that chapter, but I felt like it was a real. I kind of re-experienced it in a way. It was really interesting, and especially given, you know, what's been happening in our times. You know, we had an insurrection of our own. So that was really interesting for me anyway, to bring people what happened in the draft riots. It was 3 days of insurrection. It was more violent. They stormed the New York Times, and the New York Times had to fire upon the mobs, mostly Irish mobs, with a Gatling gun, which is a machine gun. So it was pretty serious. And they hung 3 freed Black men in New York City from trees and one child. So it was a really, really horrible time for our country. And then, there was no one in New York City to guard against all of this because everybody was off fighting. So it was a difficult time. They burned what they called the Colored Orphan Asylum at the time. So yeah, it was really, really tough. I see in the chat somebody saying, can I read a little? Gosh, that would mean I would have to find a book. I'm at my apartment. Hold on.
Do you have one there?
I might. Hold on.
Okay.
I hope so.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. I will, okay, Martha's here.
I have the advanced reader copy, which is fun because it's got pictures in it. This is Jane Eliza and Mr. Woolsey, Abby, Jane, Mary, and I think that's Eliza. And this is Georgie, the point of view character. In the paperback, they're probably going to have pictures, but oh gosh, now I have to decide what to read. I don't usually read, and I just went to the eye doctor and they dilated my pupils. So I don't know if I'm going to be the best reader in the world, but I'm happy to try. Just for context, I'm going to read. It's so hard because if I had known ahead, there's one passage in here that's about Litchfield, where they actually go up to my hometown, but I don't know if I could find it in time. Let me see. All right, so for context, this is the first chapter, and it takes place, it came from one of the letters. The Woolseys happened upon a slave auction in Charleston, and it was horrific for them to see human beings being sold. And so I thought, what better way to start the chapter? I won't be able to read the whole thing, but I'll start it at least. I don't want to
just give us a taste, and then we can do the Q&A.
Okay. Thanks, Connor, for moving me along here. I'm just, stagnating. Okay. No one suspected the blonde boy's cargo as he drove his crude pony cart through the streets of Charleston. My mother, my younger sister Georgie, and I had come to South Carolina by the invitation of Pastor Cox at the African Free Church for a 2-day stay. We'd stepped out the previous morning, past the mansion houses and palmetto trees, the atmosphere so gentle and refined, to make our daily calls and leave Mother's ecru cards on the silver trays. This is Charles Woolsey, 8 Brevoort Place, New York City. Certainly nothing forced itself unpleasantly on our attention, but every Black face in the street or greeting us so kindly at the front door reminded us of the system of slavery so robust there, and strengthened our resolve to continue the fight. Upon our walk home from Saturday services, the scent of crepe myrtle in the air, a boy driving a pony cart drew up beside us, dressed in a clean white shirt and homespun trousers. His rear wheel in disrepair, it bumped with every rotation, keeping his rate of speed much greater than ours. We found ourselves a bit lost, Mother called to the boy. Can you guide us to the Charleston Hotel? I'm going that way, ma'am. We'll point you there. I warmed to his Southern accent, a good-natured boy, milk-skinned, 12 years or so, yellow hair shining in the sun. That brought to mind my own tow-headed daughters. Where do you live, Mother asked. Here and there, he said. You sound like a Virginian. Mother happy someone recognized her accent. Indeed, I am. Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I feel like I'm just kind of going on and on. But that.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. That leads to them coming to the slave auction. And let me just read like a tiny bit of that, because that might be a little bit more interesting. The auctioneer yanked the girl's dress down off her shoulder and then grabbed her by the chin. Smile, girl. Suki forced a smile, and those dimples. She could be a fancy girl one day. The auctioneer lifted her hem to show her ankles and legs, but Suki grabbed the skirt from his hand. What's the matter with her eyes? One bidder called out. She's crying, that's all, the auctioneer said, but she's fine. Sell the girl separate, one bidder called. 600 for her. Sold, the auctioneer said. Suki's brothers locked their arms around her waist. The auctioneer pulled them from her, and the boys cried and fought him with fists. Through the bars, Georgie passed the woman mother's card, a $20 Liberty gold coin hidden beneath it. Quickly, take this. Oh, no, miss. Georgie lowered the card down the iron rung of the gate toward the woman's hand. They had met an enslaved woman at the gate. If you can make it to New York City, come to the address here on the card for help. The woman glanced about, then slipped both card and coin deep into her apron pocket. Thank you, Mrs. Most kind. I'll keep it hid. So that leads to a whole series of events where someone comes in contact with, that leads to contact between the Woolseys and an enslaved person at some point.
That sounds really exciting. That was a great sample. Thank you for that. And that was a great journey through the 3 books. Thank you for taking us through that. I really appreciate it. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about Sunflower Sisters before we maybe took some questions?
No, I think that is about it. But I'd love to hear if anybody has questions.
Sure, yeah, please. I have one here, and I wrote some down while I listened, and I want please people send in some questions, and we will get some answers. So the question here is from Donna Cobble, and she says, "Can you refresh my memory as to why the 50 older women in the photo you talked about in the Lilac house were called the Rabbits?"
You know, I always forget to say that. Thank you so much for reminding me. The Nazis nicknamed them the Rabbits because they were their kind of experimental animals, guinea pigs in a way. So that was their, kind of attempt at humor, I guess. And the women did not like being called the Rabbits. There's the word for rabbit in Polish is very similar to the word for king. And so they preferred to be called kings and not rabbits. But yeah, the Nazis thought that they were funny calling them the Rabbits. You know, Connor, I can't hear you all of a sudden.
Sorry, I had myself on mute.
Oh, that's okay.
I'll ask some of my questions while I wait for some other ones to come in. Going all the way back to the beginning of your talk, you were talking about going through Caroline's boxes in the cellar, and I was just wondering, since that's so early on in your process, what year do you think that was about? That this, your journey is beginning with writing.
It was around 2000.
Okay.
For like between 2000 and 2005.
Okay, and so that's like the genesis of the idea for the first novel?
Yes.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I know it took a long time because
Yeah.
I'd never written a book before. So by the time I started, I didn't know that you're supposed to use an outline or any of the things that I do now. Yeah. So I kept writing stuff and having to throw it out because I was like, oh, historically that isn't accurate.
Okay, thank you. And we have a few more questions coming in now.
Oh,
great. Someone asked, is there any chance you would ever write more about individual rabbits?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting idea. Maybe. I never thought about that. I did think about writing kind of a sequel to Lilac Girls, but instead I kind of went backwards. And actually, so no, I haven't really thought about that because afterwards, I wasn't sure if people would be that interested. I wasn't sure if there was that much of an arc for a whole novel because, all the kind of exciting things were over by that point in terms of the war was over. The Nazis were kind of over, well, for them anyway. And so I didn't feel like I could really sustain a whole novel. But now my 4th book is going to be going ahead from Lilac Girls. It has some of the same characters, not not Kasha or her mother, but some of the Nazis are in the fourth book. It is about two badass women who survive Ravensbrück and go back in the 1950s and hunt down the doctor that did bad things to them there all over the world. So that's called The Golden Doves. And that is going to be really fun, I think. For
Awesome.
people.
Yeah. So there's some revenge
Oh,
in
yeah.
there.
Don't love a good revenge story. I love revenge. Well,
And that,
especially because so many Nazis deserved it, and they just kind of melted away into the woodwork. And these girls were like, no, that's not going to happen with this guy. So I think it's kind of satisfying.
Mm-hmm. And that answers my question. One of my other questions is going to be if your novels were going to perpetually keep going further back in time, but no, you're going to stop
my
that.
agent, my agent put an end to that, because I was like, well, what if I went back to the Revolutionary War? And she was like, I don't know. Let's try something different. And so after these three novels that are just about Caroline's family, I'm moving on to writing from two POV characters, which is is very different and really fun. And then my fifth book, which I've been writing kind of at the same time, is a thriller. It is contemporary, and that takes place in my town, Litchfield. It says it's Massachusetts, but really not. And in my house, it takes place in my house, which is really scary. And I've scared myself to death. My husband keeps saying, we're gonna have to move now because you can't go in the like guest bedroom anymore because you're too scared. And it's like, well, I love writing about my own town. No, it's really fun. And it's just so much easier. You don't have to, like with the historical books, you have to go research what kind of a canon it was, because people, they're very specific about, one time I wrote about a stink bug in Lilac Girls, and isn't an entomologist that does bugs, but a bug person contacted me and said, if this was 1957, there was not a stink bug in the United States. It was 1958. And so it was just like, really?
Wow.
So I learned that I have to be very specific about, and when you write in current day, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about a stink bug.
Well, all your upcoming novels sound very exciting.
You
and I want to get to other people's questions because we still have 10 minutes left. I'm sure we're going to get through everybody's. In your new book, this is from Gabby. She asks, in your new book, which was the hardest part to write? Was it because of the history you were writing, or because the research you had to do? So I think possibly like because the history was so difficult that you were dealing with. I feel like that might be part of the question.
I didn't find that part hard. People often say, was it hard to write about Ravensbrück? Was it hard to write about Bolshevism because so many people died? And, I don't know what's wrong with me, but for some reason, I don't find that difficult emotionally. I don't know why. I think I need, probably some deep therapy or something, but it works for me as a novelist. And in terms of the research, that was definitely harder for the Civil War anyway, just because I had to. Learning all about World War II was a little bit easier. Civil War was harder for me. I don't know exactly why, but part of it was there are still people that remember World War II. I mean, I talked to a lot of survivors, and that was a huge wealth of information. Obviously, there's no one here from the Civil War. So, I really missed that firsthand thing. And it took a lot to make up for that. I had to read a lot, especially about plantation mistresses, because there weren't that many. There was like Mary Chestnut in the Ken Burns movies and things, but there aren't that many. There are more slave narratives than there are things written from plantation mistresses. I think, first of all, they were just super busy. It was a really hard job. It's like running a farm, especially if your husband has gone off to the war. But also back then, people it wasn't socially acceptable to write about it. Georgie even wrote 3 Weeks at Gettysburg, a very tiny novel that I ordered from Amazon, and when it came, I was so excited, but it came in like a tiny envelope, and I realized it was like as big as like a pack of gum practically. But and she got a lot of blowback from writing that, and because she was a woman in society, and that was just not done. Her sister Mary wrote the most amazing poetry, and it kind of went viral for its day. Every soldier had her poems in their pocket, North and South, because they talked about, meeting God, and she was never allowed to say that she wrote those poems, which is, I think, a huge tragedy. So I think that that's why there wasn't a whole lot about plantation mistresses, but I did finally find one book that was a gold mine, and it just had all these kind of shorter first person point of view experiences of plantation mistresses, and that really helped a lot.
Great. What was that text that you found?
I have it at home. I can't remember, but it's something about North and South. So it was women from the North and the South during the Civil War. But yeah, it was super helpful.
Awesome. Okay. Got a few more questions here. This is referring to the beginning of the process. I don't know whether they mean like of the most recent book or for when you started writing all together. Were you part of a writing group at the beginning of your process?
No, never, never, never. I am, how do I put this? I'm kind of an introvert, like a really shy person. And so just the idea of sharing my work with other people, I think that would have been way, way, way too painful for me. I don't think I would have, even in a creative writing class in school, I think one crossword from a professor and I would have just given it up. And so in a way, it was better that I wasn't. And writing groups, I don't know, you have to really have the right writing group. And Stephen King speaks to this in his wonderful writing book that I just reread or listened to on tape in February. He's so good. And he says, you really have to be careful with writing groups because they don't really know what they're talking about. So, and I'm with Stephen on that one. Not to like insult anyone's writing group. If that's working for you, that's good. But just remember, really what you need is a developmental editor, a freelance editor. And that's a million times better, I think, than a writing group.
So this goes back, I think, to when you were talking about when I asked you about if you're going to keep going back in time, but you said that you're going to change course. This person says, now that you know the publishing industry, is it easier or harder to write?
Wow, these are really good questions. That's a really, that we could talk for an hour on just on that's a hard one. In some ways easier, because at first I spent a lot of time just anguished over, will anyone read this? This is such an important story. Probably no, this is all a waste of time. And I really, I worked every day, all day on this. So I just thought, and it wasn't often that I would think that, but I think, not knowing about the publishing industry was a blessing at that point, because I didn't know what I was up against. I didn't know how hard it was to get an agent or any of that stuff. I kind of read about it on the internet and I just thought, I don't care. I'm just going to do it. And if I self-publish, I self-publish. What's the big deal? So in a way, how they say dance like no one's watching? I was writing like no one was watching. So I don't know. I think I might have self-edited a little bit, like censored myself now that I think about some of those scenes that are in Lilac Girls, but it's good, I think, to write that way. So now that I know, but on the other hand, now that I know how long it takes, that someone's actually going to be reading it, that people love it, what they like. I've gotten a lot of feedback from readers, and that's my most important thing. So in a way, I think it's easier now because I'm not just writing blind. I have an editor who is just the most wonderful, supportive person. So I know if I have a question, I can always ask her. And when I submit my manuscript, we talk about the people like they're real. And I never really had a chance to do that with Lilac Girls. So, so I guess it's easier now that I know more about publishing. But it's also terrifying because you know what the expectations are too, and how you know, you can be riding high one day and the next day not. So you just have to, I think it just takes a very cool head, which I don't have.
Okay, last question I have here. Who did you model Anne May after? She was so mean and cruel and threw her mother and Gemma under the bus to save herself.
Pat, you are right. She was horrible, wasn't she? You know, I took all of that kind of big crucible of stuff that I learned about plantation mistresses, and then added the people that I know that will remain nameless. But that was super helpful to kind of bring in people that I've run across in my lifetime that have been like that. And also, I have to be honest, a healthy dose of my own bad qualities in every character. I kind of inject my own weird bad stuff. Yeah, it's you know, I'm not proud of it, but I'm, you know, part of Anne May is me in there. You know, just the fact that, you know, we don't always, we do what we do in life. And, you know, I've kind of collected those things about myself and other people. Her mother, oh my God, was so bad. And she's kind of a compilation of some people I've known in my life. So someday, Pat, when I see you face to face, I'll, you know, I'll tell you more. The keys to the castle.
The inside scoop. All right, I'm gonna ask one or two more questions and then we can wrap it up. But if anybody has a final question they want to throw out, please feel free. I was curious. So how do you use your son's videos? How do those end up being incorporated into the final product of the novel?
That is such a great idea. I use them on social media. At the beginning, I used them on my website, and that was huge help because, you know, to get published, you really kind of have to have a presence. So I put some of them online, and I would go back and watch them too and say, hey, you know, just to have a video reference to what I was writing about, because he documented the whole camp for me. So that was super helpful because I had pictures, but not, you know, when I needed to go back and those. And then things like when we went to Gettysburg and to Sauterley Plantation, he documented all of that too. So when it came time to doing the book trailer, Random House wanted to do, since it was COVID, they wanted to do a really lovely trailer that just kind of talked about the whole book and everything. And so every on my video book tour, virtual book tour, they would play that at the beginning of every everything. And his footage is throughout that. Yeah, he's got an amazing camera. So walking around Gettysburg with him was amazing. And the footage is absolutely gorgeous. But thank you for asking that question. He would love it that he was included in this too.
Well, yeah, no, I was just so interested from your stories, but yeah, that must be invaluable to have those videos to go back and reference. And then I guess this will be our last question. I was just curious. So you mentioned Little Women and you mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin. Were there any other books that you had in mind while you were working on Sunflower Sisters?
In terms of fiction?
In terms of fiction, I guess that's where I was interested, but if the nonfiction too, since you already listed two fictions.
Yeah, I had so many nonfiction books that I read that it was just, it was unbelievable. There's actually Heart Towards Home is a really wonderful book, and that is nonfiction, but it's many of the letters. It's a wonderful companion book to Sunflower Sisters. And it's for people that are curious about the actual letters. And I use some of those in the book, but this is an actual it's a little bit hard to get through because the letters are kind of, they're written in kind of an old-fashioned voice, but that's a wonderful book, My Heart Towards Home. And you'll get a feeling, and they have all the pictures of all the characters and everything in there. And then other than that, I mean, just my usual thing, a lot of Jane Austen I draw on no matter what. I think that, I've kind of recycled a couple of her characters just because I love them so much. Like in Lost Roses, there was Luba, who's kind of a thinly veiled Sense and Sensibility character, like the little sister who's so precocious. I can't help doing that with Jane Austen because I love her so much.
Thank you for that answer. And I'll have to check out Heart Towards Home. That sounds really great.
Yeah, great.
Donna says, thank you. I loved each of your books and look forward to those that are coming soon. And I just wanted to reiterate what she said. And thank you again for spending your time with us in this last hour. It was so great. And I really liked listening to the journey that your books took you through.
Thanks, Connor. It's been really fun. I always love coming and talking to Pequot. So hopefully someday soon I'll be able to do it in person.
That would be great. My last thing I want to say is that for everyone watching, we're currently running our spring fundraising campaign, which raises critical unrestricted funds for the library operations and programs like the one that you just watched. And I'm going to leave a link in the chat for anyone who feels compelled to help us out tonight. Thank you so much again, Martha. Have a good night.
Thank you, Connor. Bye, everybody.
Bye.